My conversation today is with Jim Genaro. Jim is a fixture of the Asheville music and live performance communities, having co-created and helmed the Surreal Sirkus, an experimental, some have called psychedelic, live performance group composed of musicians, fire dancers, aerialists, and creatives of all stripes native to Asheville for over 25 years. In 2021, Jim was inspired to resurrect the Surreal Sirkus from a hiatus and has since broadened its scope to that of an arts festival focused on local Asheville performers, crafters, breweries, and food vendors. Jim has also expressed his creative impulses via a long-standing solo music project, broadly spanning many subgenres of electronic music under the moniker Logos. Logos' last album, Coronas, was self-released in 2022, and creatively inspired by the coronavirus epidemic and the consequent isolation that ensued as a product of worldwide lockdowns. As well as being versed in several types of ceremonial magic, Jim is also curator of a creative communal space called The Oracle, which hosts an array of events catered to the diverse performing arts and spiritual communities based in Asheville. I sat down at The Oracle with Jim to discuss his influences in music and magic and how he expresses these through his various projects. To learn more about Jim's various projects, check out the links below. I'm Mike Baker, and this is the Arcanvm Podcast. I know a little bit about your life, based on the hours in the car that we've spent together. You've had a really interesting story, really interesting journey. But I don't know at what point in your life that music and magic first met. When did those two things kind of combine for you, or in terms of performance and stuff like that?
Yeah, so that's it's an interesting question. I feel like it was something that sort of happened naturally, but the question of when did I recognize it consciously, I have to think a little bit about that. I would say that my earliest experiences with anything mystical, like my first sort of out-of-body experience that I had that sort of started me on this path, was very intimately connected to music. There was a piece of music that was happening at the time that it felt like the doorway that was open to that experience was created by the music, and that was when I was 13 years old. When I think it started to coalesce as a realization that those things were connected was probably really in my early 20s, when the Surreal Sirkus was first starting to form. And there are a couple kind of standout moments that really jump out for me. One was this kind of spontaneous healing session that we were doing on a friend of mine who had ovarian cancer at the time. She was a young person, but she had cancer, and we did this kind of spontaneous healing thing with her voices. And so, and it was effective, for, not trying to say that I know exactly what the cause and effect was of all of this, but after this session that we had, she had a drastic reduction in her tumors that left her doctor sort of baffled.
And you said you did that with your voices, so that was kind of like mantra, like chant healing.
Yeah, and it wasn't mantra in the sense of saying a set thing. It was more just using the force of the voice, using a tone to push energy around. That's a lot of what I was doing in those early days. We were really interested in the voice and how to kind of work energy with our voices. So that was like a thing in my sort of early 20s. I know that it had really crystallized by the time I was at the Clear Vision School in Australia, which was this meditation school I went to. And I spent a week in a desert intensive. So like I think it was like 10 days actually of being out in the desert in silence, doing meditation. And while I was there, there were a number of things that kind of came out of that experience, but one of them was the term the musician was sort of what came to me as like, this is identifying what I am. And I had this sense of my purpose being to connect people to spiritual forces through music. And so certainly by that point, by like 25, and the whole Clear Vision experience, that had sort of crystallized, but there were definitely like things I can sort of point to before that where that realization was unfolding.
That's awesome. That idea of connecting people, being that link for them, to magical or I guess supernatural forces on the other side. I think that's a really powerful thing. As a musician myself, that's not something I ever dreamed of doing. I wasn't really aware that was possible, but there are certainly, I can attest to that for sure, that there definitely is some sort of spiritual connection or interaction that's happening when you listen to a piece of music on any level, really, but particularly when you get very absorbed in it.
Well, it's like it's right there embedded in the word itself. Like music is inspiration from the muse, and like in the original, if you look at the original muses in ancient Greece, they weren't, music as we think of it wasn't one of the muses, because music was the art of receiving from the muse, and I think that's something that certainly gets very lost in our secular culture, but at the same time, it's like I think that there's like a common intuition about this that people have, because you look at the deepest experiences that people have, a lot of times there's music is at the center of it. Or you look at some of the musical stars, like think of someone like David Bowie, or even like any rock star, really, like anybody who is like holding that position where they have thousands of people focused on them, and there's really like they are kind of like the high priest of an undefined cult, or religion, but there's the sense that they are channeling or bringing something much bigger than themselves through.
So how would you describe what it is that you do? And I'm not even just talking about you as logos, as a specific musician or musical artist, but like in the broader sense, right? I mean, you curate this space here at the Oracle in Asheville. You have the Surreal Sirkus, which you've just recently resurrected like 2 years ago, and this year you had a great show as well. So there's a lot more going on there for you than just music. There's a lot of inspiration.
Well, there's a lot of different projects that I am involved with, and they're all kind of extensions of two things, really. Like one is like my own attempts to kind of channel this inspiration flow that I sometimes can tap into, and that is really like kind of the most important thing to me in terms of my music or art, is what I'm doing, like coming from a place of inspiration. And so, in some ways, Logos is like the most purely that. It's like there's something very, I don't want to say selfish, but like self-focused in terms of like, that's my project where like, this is my thing that I'm doing, and I'm trying my best to like kind of express what wants to come through me. And then I have a number of other projects where it's more, the focus is more on like this community that I'm involved with, and trying to create settings where people can sort of step up and like do that themselves too. And so the two things are like very connected, but there's a spectrum, there's like the space at the landing, the Oracle, that is, that's probably the most kind of community focused thing. Like I do that because I want to create a space for people to do spiritual practice in a way that, maybe is connected to sound or music. Not necessarily, though. There's a lot of things that happen in here, and it's really like a community center. Surreal Sirkus is kind of in between those things, too. Like a lot of the Surreal Sirkus vision is coming through me, and I won't say from me. There are parts that are from me, but there's a lot that I'm just sort of the catalyst for. But at the same time, it's very much a community project. It's something that only can exist in the context of many people pulling together. And I like all those things, but on some level, it's like what I would like to be creating is something closer to a church or a traveling circus, or one of these kind of environments where things are really taken outside of the norm, not just because I think that there's really powerful work that you can do in those spaces, but also because I think that's actually where my own art kind of thrives. Like, I think that, my music doesn't play all that well in like a nightclub or a bar. It's something that really has to be kind of like engaged with in its own environment. And so, at some point I don't know when, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg. Like, did I create the environment and the music was born through that? Or did I, have this thing that needed to happen, so I built a space for it to happen? It's a little of both, but I do think that a big part of what I'm doing is trying to create sort of the temporary autonomous zone in the Hakim Bay lingo, the space where kind of the ordinary rules of how things work can be kind of suspended long enough to have an experience that is connected and deep.
One thing I want to say particularly about the Surreal Sirkus and having participated in it myself this year is that there really is there was a surprising sense of family to a lot of the people there, and it was like, I've been hanging around you for a while, and I've been here at this space, and I've been in Asheville now for a little while, and I've not really seen any kind of other performance art or organization at the Surreal Sirkus. It was like they just kind of came together, and it seemed almost like, if you've been away from family for a really long time, and as soon as you get together or something like that for a holiday, whether it's for better or for worse, you snap back into those old roles, almost automatically. And I got the sense of a lot of that happening. But you did talk a little bit about inspiration there and how things come through you. And I'm curious, where do you go for inspiration? Like, how do you source it?
The truth is that at this point, it's like, how do I say this? I make an intention to do a thing and set like, this show is going to happen in a certain time period. And then what I find is that the inspiration kind of comes from that end state, in a sense, that it's almost like, like creating a show is like, it's sort of like a magical act in itself. Like, you set the date and like, we're going to do this thing on this time. And then you start to get these kind of ideas and little bursts of inspiration, and it builds on itself. And there's this kind of momentum that can be kind of overwhelming sometimes. Like, this was something that was like, it was very interesting to have like this very long break. So Surreal Sirkus was ended in 2015. It came back in 2021. And so I had like this, 16 years of like not doing this thing that I had done for a decade in my 20s. And then, with Surreal Sirkus, there is very much the idea of an egregore. Like you have this thing that is like it's like the sum of all the parts, but it's beyond that. It's like the egregore of the Surreal Sirkus is like its own thing, and that's something that's always been very much there. But what was weird to experience, not weird, but it was just like a little bit surprising, was how much like I was able to tap into it again as soon as the decision was made. As soon as it was like, we are doing this thing, it was like something just opened up, and then I would get these like flashes of inspiration, and it would, at times it would almost feel like a manic episode. Like I'm not bipolar, but I've been around enough bipolar people to, see how, that gets. And there's definitely like, there's a feeling of like, this stuff is just coming too fast. I don't know if you've ever read the Sandman comics, but there's and they actually showed this episode in the series that came out recently, but there's a story of a muse who is I can't remember the exact reason why she's pissed at her this artist or this writer, but she just floods him with ideas to the point where like I
think she's kidnapped by him. It's Calliope, right?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, she's kidnapped, and yes, exactly. She's kidnapped, and she. She's like, fine, you want ideas, you want inspiration, I'll give you inspiration. And it's like nonstop. And there were moments, both last year and this year, where I felt that. And it's in the Clairvision school and the training that I did, you kind of learn to work with that. And so a lot of that is sort of accessible through these kind of energetic structures above your head. So, you can access those in ways that, it's like kind of, if you're trying to like access those states and just like your regular consciousness, it's going to be rough. And, but there's a way of sort of accessing it from these structures that are like kind of above your head that enable you to, sort of have like a valve almost, or like be able to like work with it directly. And, I know I'm getting into some like deep weird stuff here.
No, this is great because this is exactly what this podcast is meant to do. Like exactly what you're talking about. So please continue.
Cool. So yeah, like I'll notice, like I'll get to this point where I'm just like having these ideas, and like I get kind of manic, and like my wife could tell you, like when I get into this state, it's like it's a little rough, and then I'll be like, okay, and I have to like kind of like pull upwards, from my physical body a little bit to like kind of deal with it up here, above my head. And yeah, and I think that, one of the pitfalls, or one of the perils of being on an artistic path, whether you're like conscious of any kind of like non-physical or supernatural or spiritual dimension to any of it, there's always this fear of like, the well will run dry, that like imagination is limited. And I definitely think there are things that can like negatively impact your ability to be creative or to like come up with ideas or be inspired. But I also firmly believe that as long as you are in a place to receive it and you're actively doing it, like there's no limit to creative inspiration.
Well, there's no limit to the egregores you can tap into. Some of them can be more harmonious than others, and some of them can kind of have this repulsion when you're working them at the same time. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, once you plug into a source like that, it is like turning on a faucet or connecting to a well.
Yeah, and that that reminds me of something that Terence McKenna used to say about, he was talking in terms of like sort of the ecological crises, and and he was like we have this whole idea, this mentality that like resources are limited, but really all resources that we have are products of our creativity and our imagination, and that is unlimited. So the idea of like thinking that the planet is doomed because we can't innovate or think or come up with solutions out of to find our way out of the crisis is like basically just putting an artificial limitation on creativity.
Actually, I heard something recently. I'm not like a huge fan of, and it's not because I don't like him. It's just I don't connect with his message particularly. But I'm not necessarily a huge fan of Gary Vee.
I don't know who that is.
He's like this motivational speaker on Instagram and social media. Kind of became a personality, like a social media influencer personality as well. But I was listening to a podcast that he was on recently, and he said something that really, really, I had like a little bit of a breakthrough moment, and because I am very apt to buy into or fall into that ideology, sometimes that fear of scarcity and doom and gloom. But he said something, and it was so beautifully put: the world is fundamentally abundant. And I don't know if it was a combination of where I was at mentally and in my life, or just the state I was in, not immediately rejecting that. But I mean, it hit me like a ton of bricks. The world is fundamentally abundant. That has never, unfortunately, it's never been my viewpoint on things, and it's starting to make more sense to me now.
Yeah, I think it's hard for anybody to really have that viewpoint because we're so, like we are limited by the things that we have access to, and on a physical level, we do experience limitations and scarcity, but and some people much more so than others. And I think that always has to be kind of acknowledged. Like I'm not super big on the whole, the secret kind of thing of like, ignoring systemic challenges or differences and just being like, well, just, manifest your way out of poverty if you're poor. Like the place we are all at is different. The starting point is different for everybody. But whatever situation you're in, like there's opportunities for like something new to be created, for your mind to come up with new ideas or new solutions to problems. And I mean, I agree. Like there's vast power just coming from our star. The sun is like this constant source of energy, and like so is your brain is kind of like, your mind is kind of like that too. Like I think of our imagination as like this kind of furnace that is generating everything that we have, and I mean we collectively, and like I don't, that's not going away unless unless you let it atrophy, unless we all can, like you can shut off those currents of inspiration pretty easily by all the things that we do that keep us diminished. And
right, fear kind of closes that door. That's the big thing, really. Fear can cut you off from inspiration, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, fear and addiction and all the various traps that keep us in that scarcity mindset. And like one thing to always be aware of is that there's a vast army of marketers out there working to keep us believing that we are, not enough, or we don't have enough, or there's something that you get this one more thing, you'll have what you need, and like there are forces at play trying to keep us from being really empowered, and it's hard to break out of that mindset. And in some ways, that's really what I'm trying to do with my more community focused projects, is like take things outside of that world. Like, even though like there's a lot of very valid criticisms of like burner culture, Burning Man and all that, I think at its heart, there was something really good that it did where, for like 1 week, you were not dealing with the world of commerce and trade. And just having that kind of break from that, where like creativity was sort of more the currency of the moment, I think it does something really good for your brain, and it inspired a lot of creativity in people. And of course, like most cool things, at some point it's gotten really latched onto by more sinister forces. But
right, yeah. Well, you had a pretty diverse experience, I think, culturally growing up. You traveled a bit. How do you think that influenced or continues to influence what you do now?
Yeah, I think you're probably alluding to like I spent some time in Haiti when I was younger, and like kind of 11 to 14, I spent part of the year in Haiti because my dad lived there. It definitely shaped a lot of things. Like if I look back, like I feel like that was like the critical kind of inflection point for who I became. Both in terms of like some of the mystical experiences, but also I think it's just it's a really different experience to be in a place where there's just tremendous poverty. And I don't think, I think it would be really good if like every American went and spent like a year in a place like Haiti or, some other like developing part of the world, because it definitely changes your experience, and it changes your perspective on the world. And how is it still affecting it? That I'm not sure of.
Well, you had some encounters, I think, with the folk religious or spiritual practices. I think it's voodoo, right? Is that what I'm?
Yeah, I had some encounters. Really, I met a voodoo priest when I was 13 there, and what happened is sort of outside of like, a simple description of like cause and effect, right? Because it's not like he and I talked a lot about voodoo, and that got me interested in it. I was already very interested in the occult, largely thanks to my grandparents were into like spiritualism, and my grandfather, who I didn't know very well, he died when I was pretty young, but he was like a faith healer, and they used to go to like Casadega in Florida, which is like this town of this like spiritualist town and stuff, and they were into that stuff. So I'd gotten some introduction to a lot of that stuff through him. But when I got to Haiti, my direct exposure to it was somewhat limited, but it ended up kind of, I had sort of an energetic, I don't even know how to like say this. Well, like assuming that your listeners on this program are, not too far down the skeptic materialist path.
I doubt it.
I basically had an encounter with an entity when I was down there, and that was something that I didn't really understand what was happening at the time. But when I got to the Clairvision school in Australia, and we were like kind of doing a lot of mapping of these things, these memories and experiences, that I really got in touch with something that felt like a past life relationship that I had had with a being. And even like before Clairvision, like very soon after I went to Haiti, actually, I had this like kind of spontaneous out of body experience that felt connected to all that too. And became the inspiration for this opera that I'm in theory working on, or in theory have been working on bit by bit for like the past 30 years to some degree. But it didn't really, I don't know, like I think because of the sort of, the cultural, like I just don't have a lot of exposure to people practicing voodoo here in like Western North Carolina. It's not a thing you encounter a whole lot. A little bit actually, more than you would expect, but not a whole lot. But and also just having this, as a white person with no, family connection to it. It's not something that seemed like a viable path. And I kind of like put those experiences down to like, okay, that was some weird shit that happened, and like I don't know what to do with that. So I kind of moved into like more areas more related to like what was accessible and to some degree what was like connected to like my ancestral lines and stuff. But it's something that has like come up again. Like we went to a voodoo ceremony in New Orleans. My wife and I did.
When was that?
It was in 2020. It was kind of towards the later part of the pandemic or whatever. We got to New Orleans right as all the restrictions were lifting, so September or something like that. And when we went to that ceremony, it really like something really clicked, and like the energies, the presence of the loa, the beings that they worked with felt very familiar to me, and so it's something I really have not yet unpacked, but it's interesting. And whatever that looks like in the future, definitely just even having some kind of experience of a being or of a energy outside of myself as a kid definitely, launched me onto this path.
You talk about being in the mountains of Western North Carolina, but in a sense to me, I feel like this place is your playground. And I'm wondering from your own perspective, how does your environment, like being an Ashevillian, if that's the right term for it. How do you...
Ashevillian.
Right. How does that influence or affect your output just in general? I mean, you've got so much behind you and so many different experiences, and it's all kind of focused right here. And you definitely have established quite a presence in multiple communities.
Yeah, it has. I mean, obviously it's had a huge impact. It's a little bit like the fish trying to describe what water is in a way. Like I've been here so long. I came here at 19, and when I first encountered it, I had a very rough patch when I first got to Asheville, and there were a lot of reasons for that. But part of it was, frankly, experiencing seasons for the first time as somebody who grew up in Florida and didn't really have that kind of rhythm as part of their life. I do feel like the seasons here are very, I want to say that they're distinct. The truth is that it gets very muddy. You can have a summer day in the middle of winter, but the natural cycles are something that I experience here more than I certainly did as a kid growing up in Florida. But beyond that, there were some interesting things that I encountered when I spent my first year at a school called Warren Wilson College that is basically tucked away up in the mountains. So like you're living more or less in a forest. And there were things that I encountered in the woods there that just energetically that felt very foreign and kind of strange and disturbing to me. And some of that was wrapped up in the way that like things kind of fell apart for me in that my first couple of years here in Asheville. And then I just kind of like stayed and built, I sometimes I use this metaphor of like a shipwreck. Like I feel like I got kind of shipwrecked here in Asheville and then like, made the best of it and built a little hut out of the pieces of the ship that were left. And whether that's an entirely accurate metaphor or not is up for debate, but what definitely happened was that I kind of made a life and a community and a family here in the years that followed. And a lot of that had to do with the Surreal Sirkus. You said the family thing, was something that stuck out to you about the circus. Well, that was kind of the core of it for me, was like this community or this family of people. And, it's hard to separate like me from Asheville at this point. When I've spent periods of time away, honestly, it's often really good. Like, I think that, in some ways I kind of wish I had left earlier, and I don't know that I'll always be here, but, at the same time, I always come back. There's something that kind of pulls me back, and like, definitely the mountains feel like this home, not just home, but like that sense of like rest, like, okay, I'm, someplace safe again when I get back. It also feels really limiting in certain ways. You don't have the far vistas that you do out west, or even in Florida. You don't have, frankly, you don't have that much culturally going on in the ways that, you would in a bigger city anywhere else. And so I've had to kind of like build with what I've got here. And I think that was the thing about Asheville that like kept me here when I was like 20 and, could have done something different, was, especially in those days, Asheville was very run down. There was not much happening. And I felt like I could build something here, that wouldn't necessarily be doable elsewhere. So,
yeah, it's interesting that you bring up sort of having an energetic experience in the mountains at Warren Wilson, because that's definitely one of the first things that stuck out to me about Asheville when I came here. I think I probably told you about this, and I'm not going to go into it now, but when Nicole and I, my partner Nicole, when we came down here for the first time, it was our first trip. I mean, the first night we had a shared like entity experience. It was, and I've never had a shared experience with somebody before. And then I got to go back up to New York, where we were living at the time, and feel the difference. And there's a palpable energetic difference. And even in the times where I'm shuttling myself back and forth for various, bunkings on the head and magical merit badges, I get up there and somewhere around the New Jersey Turnpike, but particularly, if I'm heading into Long Island or the city, somewhere right around like the bridge, right by the Hudson, everything shifts. It's like everything just drops and becomes quite heavy. And when I get back into these mountains on my way back, even just hitting, going through Tennessee or something like that, there's a levity. There's definitely a spiritual activity here. And I think a lot of people are drawn here subconsciously by that energy. I think this is definitely a place to heal. I think a lot of people that are here are healing, right? I mean, even that's what brought the Vanderbilts down here. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about that being one of the primary experiences that stood out for you. But you've had such breadth of experience in other traditions and just walks of life. I'm curious, what is magic to you? How do you define it? I mean, definitions can be sterile and difficult. So how do you experience it? How do you experience magic?
Yeah, I like how you say that, because the definitions are easy to come up with, and there's been a lot of, more knowledgeable people than me thinking about this and saying it. But in terms of what I actually experience about it, I think that at some fundamental level, this is what I believe and experience. Consciousness and the external world are one continuum. And that's something that, in theory, we all get the, even from a purely materialistic perspective, there's nothing that we can have a conversation about that isn't basically being constructed by our minds putting together a stimulus that, is there anything other than my perceptions. I mean, yeah, you at some point you hit these kind of like, bear tree falling in the woods. I started to say bear shitting in the woods, but it's mixing my metaphors here. At some point you hit this kind of like, is there an objective reality? And like, and I think that where it falls for me is like, yes, there is an objective reality that includes the contents of my consciousness. Like, I don't think that everything is an illusion being projected by my consciousness. I think that my ability to perceive reality may be definitely is very limited, but I think that there's not some hard line between self and outside reality. So that's kind of like a starting point, right? So then magic, to me, becomes about how you affect the world through your consciousness. I tend to like buy into the, art is I think it was Starhawk, I believe, described it as the act of changing consciousness at will. And I think that's kind of an interesting, it's like kind of using a how to define a what, but when you change your consciousness, the experiences that you have of the outer world changes also. And I think there are vast untapped potentials to that. Untapped by me, at least. Untapped by most people, I think. And yeah, so to me, magic is that. Now, what are you doing when you do a ritual and you set an intention and you're kind of using these structures? Like, to me, it's all about like externalizing the inner world, or the inner, like projecting your mind into these kind of forms that you create, whether that's like physically with tools and funny costumes and wands and sticks and stuff, or or whether it's something that you're just purely doing in your mind. I think the props help. First of all, let me just say, like, theater to me is like a form of magic, and that was the original sort of purpose of it. You can do a play with just people reading lines, or like there are readings where people do those things, but the more that you kind of bring these external elements, you have sets and maybe you have props and costumes and stuff, the more that it is easier to kind of bring someone else into that experience, or to bring yourself into it. When you put on a uniform of some organization, you enter that mindset, and it's not that the uniform is necessary, but it's helpful. So I think that,
it could help. I find that things like that help you to connect to the egregore by using, certain things that are associated with it. And it's really interesting what you're talking about with theater as magic, because a lot of actors will say at a certain point, kind of similar to what we as musicians experience. I mean, the best actors kind of lose themselves. They lose themselves, and to me, that's a kind of invocation. I've now invoked something else, and it's moving through me. And I think you can see that in a performance, and you can hear that and feel that in a performance. And I can definitely say that the most miraculous kinds of experiences I have had have been when I was playing music and lost myself. So that's a really interesting thing, particularly given what it is that you do, which is an intersection of all three of these things: theater, music, magic. I really love also how, especially in the last two Surreal Sirkus performances, there were public rituals. I mean, that was awesome.
Yeah, there's always a public ritual. There's always a ritual element with Surreal Sirkus. Sometimes that's more explicit than others. This year, I had the inspiration, and this is honestly the thing that made the whole thing kind of coalesce for me, of a Well, initially I'd had the idea, like the first seed vision, and this is often how it works for me. Is like, I say, okay, I'm going to do the Surreal Circus show, and then I wait, and somewhere like in a dream or in this was actually in like on a half awake sleep, I got these two kind of seed images, and then those became the core of everything that unfolded. But one of them was the James Webb Telescope as a projection surface. And then the other was the idea of turning the circus on its side. And the first one kind of lent itself to this very tangible thing that I was able to build, this kind of cool mapped projection surface. But the one that was really like sticking with me was like, how do you turn a circus on its side? And one night I got hit with like this like revelatory experience that was like, made me realize like, when you have a 3-ring circus, you have essentially 3 circles that are like on a horizontal plane. And so if you turn that on its side, one way to conceive that would be 3 concentric rings. And so when I saw that, I got that the whole thing, so there's like the Surreal Circus Festival, which is the event, and it's, takes up a park, and it has certain, parameters to it. It's all mapped out in a physical space, and that's the first ring. And then there is the show, which is like a moment or a period of time within that festival where the Surreal Circus comes out and performs, and there's kind of a storyline to it. And then within that, there was the third circle was the ritual, and for those who weren't there, basically the park has this kind of circular platform in the middle of it, and it's has like a water feature during the day that kids go and splash around in jets of water, but at night they turn it off. And so we had this like witch ritual that was part of the show. Like it was something that was happening within the context of the story being told, but like that was actually like the real thing. And I think that's where, like there's always some degree of like the tension between belief and like suspension of belief, or like belief and doubt, I think is like a huge part of all 3 of these things. You watch a movie even, and you like, in your mind that these are actors and special effects and none of this is real, but like, at the same time, the part of us that operates through stories wants to, believe the story. And the more you can believe the story, the more compelling the experience can be. And so with, a show like the Surreal Circus that we did just now, it was like, there's this sort of tension of like, is the ritual that's happening part of the story, or is it the real thing? And like that's where I think it's that's where I think like magic as theater usually succeeds, is when you have kind of the outer shell that's like, this is the story that we're telling, and then inside of it you have like the kernel of like truth, or the kernel of like reality, and sometimes it's a journey through that.
Typically in ancient Greece, when they would have the public ritual that eventually became what we know as theatrical productions, a lot of times there were reproductions of myths. And that's exactly what myths are. They're like this kind of fairy tale, this outer shell that contains that kernel of esoteric truth inside of it.
Yeah, I always think like the best place to hide something is right in the center of everyone's face too.
Yeah.
Not that we were trying to hide it, but there's something a little bit subversive about having a ritual in the middle of the downtown on the most public spot possible. But
yeah. So what is next on your docket? What have you got going on?
Yeah, well, let's see. In the very immediate term, I am throwing my annual ridiculously over the top Christmas party, aka Dreamtide, the winter solstice event that we do here at the Landing, and I'm kind of excited about it because we're doing like a tarot theme. So the whole thing is going to be a series of There's going to be a series of vignettes throughout the night that sort of unveil the different tarot archetypes, and we're going to be doing some cool stuff with that, with the projection screen. People will be able to like come do a tarot reading where they press a button, and just like the random images appeared on the circus show, they'll have like this giant projection surface that shows their card. And anyway, that's like just the sort of near term thing that's coming up for winter solstice. Then I'm sort of at this kind of regrouping point where I'm really ready to work on the opera. Like that's honestly the thing. I mentioned it earlier, but basically I had this vision when I was 13, and then how I have understood and processed that has changed a lot over the 35 years or whatever it's been since then. But where I kind of landed was there's this kind of myth, this story that I want to tell as an opera, as an electronic opera. So using electronic dance music as kind of the format of it. And it's about Dionysus and Apollo and that sort of polarity, which is of course like that's a thread throughout Western culture, with like Nietzsche wrote a book about this, and it's the two kind of poles of among other things, it's the two poles of music in ancient Greek culture. You had like the Dionysian music, which was like the music of the dance and ecstasy and wine and all that, and it has its modern equivalents in like EDM and rock and roll for that matter, and all kinds of modern music. But then you have the Apollonian stream, which is the sort of solar narrative storytelling version of music, and that's where you get opera and songwriting and all those kind of things. And and there's been this kind of continuous sort of dance between those two poles throughout the history of Western music, and and it's not, none of this is like radically insightful new material or anything, but that's sort of the context, and then putting that story into like a modern setting where basically an excess of one, like things swinging too far in the Apollonian direction is like leading to this kind of over solarification. I don't know if that's even a word, but this the idea is that we've become so embedded in like the rational and and it's complicated because I think like in some ways our times are more irrational than they've ever been, but the power structures of the world have the mechanistic kind of materialist, rationalist worldview has brought us to a point of like near catastrophe, environmentally speaking and such. And so the idea and the way this is sort of told in the story is that then that Dionysus is sort of called to step into the limelight in a sense and sort of try to counteract what has happened as Apollo has gone like too far down one extreme. Anyway, without getting into all the details of it, there's an opera that's been brewing in my head, and some many a notebook, and some music has been written, but it was always kind of my intention to start it when I did, but then kind of projects keep coming up, like then COVID happened and I had to write a whole album about the COVID experience. And so I've pretty much cleared the docket, and what I'm working on next is this, electronic opera about Dionysus and Apollo in a modern setting.
Do you think that that's a Logos project or a Surreal Sirkus slash performance family project? Is it both?
Well, it's some of both. It is a logos project. Yes, fundamentally it is. It's something that I'm writing in that context. The real plan, though, the long game here, I hate to give away my long game, but
no pressure.
The long game is to have a traveling circus festival that's really it's part traveling carnival and part Dionysian festival. So the idea is that we would have this mobile event that could set up, ideally in a circus tent somewhere, and go to a town, and then there would be like a weekend-long festival, and it's got elements of the tent revival to it, and it's got elements of like the Festival of Dionysus, where you would have different theatrical productions that were performed. So there would be ritual, and there would be, of course, there'd be a big dance party, because a lot of my influences coming out of like, EDM and rave culture and stuff, and trance, psytrance especially. So, yeah, like its proper setting would be, one of the pieces that's performed in a 2 or 3 day festival somewhere. Now, will we get to that point, and when? I don't know. That's something I've been kind of brewing up for a long time, and but that's kind of that's the 10-year plan, maybe 5-year plan. We'll see.
All right. So, final question: 3 books and/or artists in any medium that you'd recommend anyone who's listening to this should check out.
Yeah. Okay. I was thinking about this today. I had gotten a little bit of a spoiler alert that this question was going to come up, and my immediate thought was, "Oh shit! What's the last book I've read?" It's been the internet kind of broke me for books. So honestly, some of my influences are kind of older when I think about the things that shaped me. One that I will definitely throw out and vouch for is a very short book by Alex Gray called The Mission of Art. Alex Gray, the painter that does all the kind of psychedelic anatomy, very anatomy focused paintings that at least when I was going to college were a common feature among the dorm rooms of all your stoner friends had the posters on the walls.
Or your friends who were super into Tool.
Yeah, or Tool. Yeah, Tool's the main, yes. The guy who does all the artwork for Tool. But he wrote this little tract called The Mission of Art that I think is one of the best things I've read about kind of the artist as a spiritual seeker, or, part of it's about the responsibility of the artist to not just do art for themselves, but to like serve something higher, and to, and that includes doing the unpleasant business of actually putting yourself out there and seeing your projects to completion and stuff like that. So I love that book a lot. Another one, you can tell I'm like not that deep of an intellectual, because all the books I'm recommending are more like little tracts than full books. But
the interesting thing is, like, to be honest with you, so many of the things that like totally changed my life were like 50 pages, 100 pages, because you don't need to say a lot.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a set of essays by Hakim Bey that were very influential to me. Hakim Bey just passed this past year, fairly recently. But he was an anarchist philosopher who he's a really interesting one to me. I'm definitely not enough of an intellectual to be an anarchist. Really, like that's a lot of reading and thinking deep things that I don't have the patience for. But But Hakim Bey was somebody who I think had this very interesting approach to it, where instead of trying to tear down the structures of capitalism or whatever, it was more like his idea was the idea of the TAZ, the temporary autonomous zone, and that's the name of the book. And there's actually, my first introduction to it was an album by him and Bill Laswell, where he sets readings of, he's like, Hakim Bey's reading the essays, and and there's like music and sound effects going. I love Bill Laswell, by the way. Anything he does is great. But anyway, so the idea of the TAZ is that you create these little pockets of freedom within the structure. So like the idea is like, you're never gonna like tear down oppression, like the state is always going to be there, or at least it's not, you're not going to tear it down by like directly fighting it, But, and again, this kind of gets back to this idea of like, your mind is, connected to everything, and this is where the real fight is like within yourself. So you can create these environments that he called temporary autonomous zones, where for a little while you suspend all of the rules of society, or you suspend at least the expectations of like behaving and thinking in a certain way, and then you kind of create like a little hole in the reality. It's like kind of tearing little holes in the consensus reality. And, that could be like something like Burning Man, but it could also be like a potluck with your friends, or it could be, a ritual. It could, like on some level, that's like its own temporary autonomous zone with different structures. And that this is how you start to like free your mind. And there's other things in that same book, like his essay on poetic terrorism was one of the things that really inspired the Surreal Sirkus, actually. The idea of like using art to create an experience of like emotional shock that could be, comparable to the level of emotion that people have in an act of terror, but instead of being terror, it's like a sense of wonderment or joy, or like just confusion, That's this was a pre 9/11 book, so probably a little easier to make light of terrorism than it would have a few years later.
Well, at least it's doing something useful with it.
Yeah. And then the third thing, I'm going to take an easy out here, because there are a couple other books that I was really influenced by. Certainly my teacher, Samuel Sagan, had a series of books called Atlantean Secrets that were really inspirational to me too. But you gave me the out of music, or, book or some other thing. And
that's right.
And I want to like give a shout out to this band Heilung, who I've been really into lately. Because I think they're one of the groups that does the thing that I'm getting at the best. And then they're coming from like a sort of Norse and German, like European folklore kind of place. So they're a band that is very much, they're kind of adjacent to like kind of the Norse metal scene, but the music is not that. The music is like all created through either drums or vocals or percussive instruments. They have like instruments made out of bones, even human bones, and rattles, and they're doing they do use samples, but one of their parameters that they work within is that every sound that they use has to be something that could have been recorded or could have been heard in like pre-Christian Europe. So nothing modern in it,
That's
but
awesome.
They do use samplers to kind of bring those in, but and it's like chanting, and they're using language that it's all taken from like sort of like medieval Germanic and Norse poetry, in some cases they're singing in languages where we don't know what they're singing because or what the words are, because we don't have translations for those languages. And they do this all within like a ritual context. So their shows are rituals. They have like opening circles, and they do a lot of theatrical things. So, they have like some of what they do is like kind of medieval war poetry, where they have soldiers that are, dressed in like the full like regalia of like a medieval soldier with like shields and spears, and they're like rhythmically stomping and like banging their spears. And the whole thing is like, it is that intersection of like theater and ritual and music. And it's wild. But Heilung, Heilung, it means healing in German, and highly recommend checking them out.
Awesome. Well, Jim Genaro, thank you so much, man. I mean, you're a fascinating dude. I love you, and thank you for talking with me.
Yeah, you're welcome, man. Thanks for having me. It's great. Enjoyed it.